sé is fiche a cóide go club leabhar ban údar an iarthar seachtain na trí. Á choirí láthair ag leabharlann Feiblí na Gaillimhe le tacaíocht ó Creative Ireland. Míle fáilte roimh a cóide, you're all very welcome to our third session of the Women Writers of the West Book Club, live from beautiful Oranmore Library. Well, we've really enjoyed the last fortnight. We discussed our first book, Elaine Feeney's As You Were, her debut novel. And over the past 2 days, Elaine has actually won the Kate O'Brien 2021 award for the book. So heartiest congrats to Elaine. And we're moving on to our second book this evening, and this is Academy Street by Mary Costello. This beautiful debut novel won a host of accolades and awards, including the Novel of the Year at the Irish Book Awards in 2014. As you can see from the schedule, we're slowing down the enjoyable process of reading, one of life's great pleasures. And we're taking 2 weeks on each book, and we're giving readers a chance to finish the book in the second week, so we're easing our way into each book in the first week. So our book this evening is Academy Street, this beautiful slim novel that traverses 7 decades and introduces us to the quiet world of Tess Lohan, who's growing up in the west of Ireland in the 1940s and coming to terms with the death of her mother. And as the cover jacket says, Tess is a shy, introverted child, but beneath her quiet exterior lies a heart of fire. A fire that will later drive her to make her home among the hurly-burly of 1960s New York. So we'll come on now to our group discussion about the book. I have 3 different questions that I share each week, and they're just as a guide to stimulate your discussion. You feel free to range far and wide in your chat. And after then, we'll have the privilege of speaking to Mary. So here are the questions for this evening, and they're very, easy, gentle questions. Did you identify with the character of Tess? Did she come alive for you? Now, if you didn't identify with her, maybe there's someone in your family who reminds you of Tess, or, maybe she just brings someone else to life for you. But did you identify with her, firstly? Secondly, what feelings does this book evoke for you? It's full of emotion, many turbulent emotions, lots of grief, but also a real compassion and sensitivity. And so I'd be interested to hear how this book made you feel. And thirdly, what do you think the author's purpose was in writing this book? What themes and ideas is she trying to explore and to get across? Welcome back, everyone. So thank you for telling us where you're joining from. So it was lovely. I managed to get around to everyone, and it was really interesting to hear the diversity of opinions about the book. Mostly very positive, it has to be said. And I think many people were very moved, I suppose, by Tess's world and her experience and her sensitivity. And I suppose the way that the grief kind of shapes, the rest of her life in many ways. So it'd be lovely just to hear a little bit from each room. So we go around quickly, and then we'll go to talk to our special guest, Mary. So in room 1, we had Breda, Eileen, Kay, and Mary. So if I remember correctly, you were quite struck by the relationship with Mike Connolly and things like that. And would someone like to feedback a little bit of what you were talking about there? So Breda, Eileen, Kay, or Mary? Would anyone like to?
Will I say something?
Okay, that's great, yeah.
Well, we thought to identify with the little girl. Mary was saying that she could really identify with her, but whereas later on to go into America, we couldn't identify so much with her, but the characterization of all the characters were just beautifully drawn, all of them. And so the feelings were, we were very compassionate towards Tess and her life and what she had to go through. It was so tragic, and then I guess the what was the purpose of the author. We just weren't sure about that, actually. So, but we all really enjoyed the book, and yes, we found it very believable, and it was
Thanks
wonderful.
very much, Kay. Thanks. So you found it very credible. You found her a credible character and well drawn and everything, vivid and brilliant. That's great. We'll be able to put those questions to Mary shortly now about what she was trying to achieve with the book. So in room 2, we had Bernie, Patricia, Regina and Rosie. And I remember you were struck by how introverted she was and the challenges of portraying an introverted, quiet, timid person, you know, in a book like this, kind of a non-flashy character, and how well that Mary achieved that. But I remember that was one of the points. Would somebody like to feedback from room 2 there? So Bernie, Patricia, Regina and Rosie.
Well, I think it's I think my camera's the only one, my mic is the only one that's on.
Might as well keep going, Patricia, now.
We three of us enjoyed the book.
Yes.
We had somebody who still has to read the book.
Yes.
We could identify, and it was very interesting because I must admit, talking about it, discussing the book, I actually saw things in it that I had missed.
Yeah,
interesting.
It was great to hear some of the other views on it as well. We all felt it was a very sad book.
Yes.
I won't say we argued, but we discussed whether it was actually about immigration or whether it was about the effect of losing her mother, kind of what life was like for people who had to leave home without really having a choice, where you just went abroad. Although we felt that she possibly could have had a choice. We're not sure. Maybe Mary might have.
Yes, yes, we'd ask her that. And you heard it on Audible, Patricia, wasn't that right? I think I recall you said. Yes. So that's a whole other experience of the book as well.
Melanie McHugh.
Melanie McHugh narrated it. Oh, that's so interesting. Okay, room 3, we had Aoife, Benita, Eileen and Joe. Could I ask somebody there to feedback a little bit about what you were talking about? Anyone like to? Will I pick somebody randomly and put them on the spot? How about Aoife?
Will Eileen do it, maybe? Eileen?
What would Eileen like to do? Eileen, you've been nominated. The pressure's on, Eileen.
I've been nominated.
I'll have to do a reaction for you. Wait till we see. I get the emoji going here. Thumbs up for Eileen.
Oh dear. There might be different reactions after I've spoken. I feel somewhat of a fraud speaking because I hadn't actually read her. I asked the others, would they, to sell it to me, and they certainly did.
Yeah.
The character appealed to people, and I think what people found refreshing was that she was an introverted character who has been given center stage in the novel, and we were kind of discussing how much skill that takes for a writer to to delve into the deep interiority of a character like that, and bring them to the fore of a story without kind of sometimes with the more showy character you can be more superficial, gloss over things, whereas with the character that she uses, it requires a lot of depth and delving. So that was something we're kind of curious of learning more about.
That's a lovely note to segue into the interview, because I see Mary has joined us now, and that's a lovely compliment, Mary, to begin. You're very welcome.
Thank you.
It's
Thanks
wonderful
for having
to have
me.
you with us. Really fantastic to have you with us. So Mary, just to recap on her glittering credentials here, her first book, The China Factory, was nominated for the Guardian First Book Award and an Irish Book Award. Academy Street won the Irish Novel of the Year and the Irish Book of the Year awards. and was shortlisted for the International Dublin Literary Award, the Costa First Novel Prize, and the EU Prize for Literature. The River Capture 2019, another beautiful book, I'm still making my way through it, was shortlisted for the Irish Book Awards, the Kerry Group Novel of the Year, and the Dalkey Novel Award. You're very welcome, Mary.
Thanks very much, Emily. Thanks for having me.
Really wonderful to have you here. Gosh, there's so many things to ask you, but the good part is that we have next week as well. So if we don't cover everything tonight, we have next week to look forward to too. I suppose one of the things that really struck me is that this book is very cinematic. From the opening sentence, you know, the first few sentences where you say, "It is evening and the window is open a little. There are voices in the hall, footsteps running up and down the stairs, then along the back corridor toward the kitchen." It's almost like a kind of a mise en scène that you're setting in the interior of a film. Are you a very visual thinker? Do you kind of see each scene in your mind's eye before you write it? Or how would you say, do you have that kind of, is it very imagistic the way it comes to you?
I wouldn't have thought so, actually. I'm noted for not being observant at all. Martin, my partner, even today, there's an outside light in this house. We've been in the house for 5 years, and there's an outside light near the front door that I've never seen until this evening. So there's some things that I completely miss. So I never thought of myself as strongly visual at all. And you know, as you're reading that there, I think when you read those lines, I think it's sound that I know that the sensory elements of a book have to be to the fore, as well as the feeling elements, obviously. But I would never have described, in fact, I rarely describe characters. It's hard enough to know. I used to often get that of people reading stories. They couldn't figure out what the character looked like, whether she was tall or small. So I actually do the barest detail on physical stuff. I think just what's necessary. Now, in that opening chapter, it's from the child's point of view. So a child is very intimate with the physical world around them. You know, they're like an animal. Everything is very close up and personal, and they live entirely in the sensory world. You know, they don't necessarily think of the future or the past. They're not thinking of next week, so it's very immediate and up close. So I think that that might be, you know, the opening there in the child section at the beginning of that book is probably more sensory and maybe visual than later parts, because I do only think of the bare. I think that the main thing that drives me for a character is the interior life. That's where I get the energy from. That's what interests me, their thoughts and their anxieties or their worries or whatever. Of course, they have to live in the physical world, and Tess does. She lives fully in the real world. You know, a lot of, you know, to be honest, lots of people didn't like Tess. They found her too quiet or too passive. And I used to think, how could she be passive? She had a child. She went to America. She had a career. She reared her son. She lived fully in the world and functioned fully in the world, you know. But I absolutely understand that particular opinion as well, because on the face of it, she's kind of flat. And some people want to shake her. I understand that. But to me, she has a very active inner life. As someone said, she is an introvert.
Yes, that cropped up in one of the rooms. I think somebody said, was it maybe Rosie of my lad? That just you wanted to give her a little nudge sometimes and say, come on.
I want to give her a kick up the arse.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, lots of people
but she does leave her aunt's house and moves in with her friend, and she does, you know, she does a few.
She goes to America, yeah.
Yeah, she definitely does do that too. So if I'm to play devil's advocate for a minute there, many would say, you know, as Eileen was saying, that in choosing to write about an outwardly unremarkable protagonist who leads a timid life, you're setting yourself a difficult task. And indeed, as Eileen, you know, very aptly put it, you know, it's a challenge, and you did this beautifully, you know. And as you've said yourself, it's the interior life you're interested in exploring, not the worldly outwardly trappings of success, I suppose. But, you know, was that very challenging to go deep into the psyche, to go deep into the interiority?
It was. I wouldn't know how to depict a character. To me, that is where the riches or the value lies, I suppose, because you know, we can dress ourselves up. I used to be a teacher, and in class, you know, sometimes the quieter kids were the ones I was drawn to. You know, we all know, and it is true, the ones who are able to answer and the ones who are able to be heard. We live in a very extroverted society, and it's easy to value and express and measure success in an extroverted society. You look well, you speak well, you have a nice house, a car, career, good children, whatever. It's very hard to measure the value when it's interior. And a lot of the population are, parents used to sometimes come to me and say, you know, Tom is very quiet and I wish he'd answer more in class, and I wish he'd come out himself more, or Neve is very withdrawn, and I always used to think that I wouldn't want to force something different on a child or be forced on me, because you're trying to bring out a nature that isn't natural to them. And I always thought the quiet ones were often even if they didn't give the answer, even if they weren't heard, I knew that they had a rich interior life, and I knew that that was the value. But we live in the Western world, especially, we live in a very extroverted society where so much value is put on appearances and the ability to express, and the interior world and is not much valued. So
is that changing? I know that Susan Cain's book came out in 2012, The Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking. And, you know, and then we have, you know, more recognition for highly sensitive people, HSPs and all the rest.
Yes.
Do you think that things are changing for the better?
I hope so. And certainly that's one of the things that has come to the fore in the lockdown, because for introverts, it wasn't a bit harder. It hasn't, notwithstanding illness and loss and all this, you know, anxieties and psychological stresses, I absolutely understand. But for a lot of people, it was a comfort not to have to face the world. And I think that maybe there is a little bit of a shift. Time will tell. I don't know. But certainly for Tess, that was one of the things. I never thought I thought she had a life of, you know, lots of energy. I studied Jung for a few years. I did Jungian psychotherapy and analysis. And one of the, you know, he coined those terms, introvert and extrovert. And people often misunderstand them. And the term introvert doesn't mean you're very, very quiet or anything. It means you get your energy from within. You get it from the interior rather than you get energy from the exterior. And, you know, if you're in the environment, like if I'm around, you know, work or family or for days or whatever, and if you don't have time to withdraw into it, I get cranky or I get off a little bit. You know, it's the natural state for some. It isn't, one is not better than the other or anything. It's just that it's different. But in a very extroverted society, it is a little bit harder. It's harder to measure. So often those parents would say, oh, I'm so worried about he doesn't come forward or whatever. Why would you want to change somebody's natural, you know?
Yeah, and there are lots of professions, or there are lots of places for people who get their energy from the interior. You know, it's yeah. Easterfield fascinates, and in fact, in some of the breakout rooms, people were saying Easterfield is almost a character in the novel. You know, and we first got introduced to Easterfield in the China Factory in your story, You Fill Up My Senses. This wonderful, your first collection of short stories. Is Easterfield based on somewhere actually historic, some homestead, or is it fictional?
It is. The name is made up. Well, there are a couple of villages, I think, around the country. There's a place in Roscommon called Easterfield. I remember hearing it and I thought, oh, what a lovely name. But the actual house in my novel Easterfield is based on the house my mother grew up on in Galway. And I knew it when I was a child. She grew up in a big old house, you know, it was not in great condition. By the time I knew it as a child in the 70s, it was, you know, not very well kept or anything. My uncle and his family inherited, and my cousins have that farm now. But it had been, when my mother was young, you know, there were 2 stairs and a long driveway and a basement, and not well kept at this stage, but there were, you know, Adam's fireplaces and that. And the history of the house was that it had been a landlord's house way back, and a bigger estate that by the time my grandfather bought it in 1911, and with, you know, 150, you know, much smaller, not a big estate. They weren't wealthy in that sense, but the history of it was it had been a landlord's house, and then it was vacant for a few years in the 1840s, and the local workhouse became overcrowded and it was used as an overfill. It was used as a fever hospital during the famine. And I looked up the Galway Health Board's reports at the time, and there were up to 279 patients in it at one point, of which 170 died. Many of them were buried on the ground. Now, when I did this research, my mother, as a little girl, would have played in those fields and didn't know this, but locals would have known it. And they, there were stories that they were buried in pits of lime and, carted to the local graveyard and everything. And, locals on the roadside dying and everything. And I remember thinking, my God, my mother and her sisters and brothers played in this ground and didn't know the history. And I do think that a land retains its wounds, and that I think Tess is porous to that as a small child. She doesn't know this until she learns later in school that there was a history to the Easterfield. But she's porous to those kind of vibrations and the wounds of a land and the scars that something like this would have left on it. But as a child, I certainly remembered running up and down the stairs, and it was a bit scary in parts and everything. But yes, it is based on my mother's own
that explains something of the feeling for it, the sensitivity that you bring to it. So can you tell us a bit more? It's been lovely to hear about the point of view in the first part of the child, and I know we might talk next week a bit more about techniques and processes. So evolving out of that story, You Fill Up My Senses, can you tell us how the book took shape as a novel? How did it, was it Tess demanding to be written, or was it the themes of grief and Easterfield, or how did it evolve?
No, it was definitely Tess, the character and the story. Okay. I do get asked a lot because, it's single motherhood. The book came out in 2014, just after the Tuam baby story had broken, and it's set not that far from Tuam, and I had not at all written this novel as any comment on single motherhood, the social mores of Ireland of the time, immigration. I don't write with any social theme. I'm not a historian. I don't feel I have any right to comment on. Of course, life was terrible for women, especially, and children, but for many people in the 40s and 50s, there was a lot of poverty. But I don't feel that that's anything. I don't set out to write about a theme or an instant. The first thing that is the story is the dominant drive for me, and the character, of course. So I did have this little girl mentioned in the story You Fill Up My Senses. The little girl's mother grew up in Easterfield, and when I was a little girl, I was very close to my mother. I still am. She's in her 80s, waiting for her vaccine, but she. When I was maybe 7 or 8, I'm not sure what age, but I became aware that she lost her mother when she was about 3. And her mother died when she was 3. And I remember thinking, I was in that little way, in the way a child can be. I was almost in love with my mother. She's a nice woman. She still is. Yeah. But I loved her. Yeah. And the thought, when that came into my consciousness, the thought that she had no mother, I would look at her sometimes and think, you had no mother. And my heart used to break for the little girl that she was, because I couldn't imagine not having a mother. So when I got older then, that was always in my mind. And the story of my mother's family, her mother had died when my mother was 3, and my mother's older sisters were in boarding school in Tuam. And when the mother died, the older teenage girls were taken out of school to marry or to manage to look after the younger ones. And they were all kept together. In those days, often if a parent died, they would be farmed out or, sent to aunts and uncles, but the family stayed together. The father kept them together. But I always thought about the way a huge catastrophe like this, like the death of a parent, can change the trajectory of a whole family. Yeah. Those older sisters didn't go back to boarding school. Their friends became teachers or doctors or whatever. My mother didn't. Now her sister became a nurse, and a few of them had careers. But I just wondered how, when something like this happens, how the whole trajectory of my mother's mother had been a nurse herself, the woman who died, and she was 42. And how the trajectory of a family can change, and how even into the next generation, the effects of that can be felt. So that was my impulse. And my mother used to tell me little stories, about her childhood, the chickens hatching out under the red lamp under the stairs, and the up and down the stairs, and the coach house, and they had a workman, and lots of stories like that. Plus, one of her sisters, Carmel, became a nurse. She went to the Richmond in Dublin, and she trained as a nurse.
Yes, and I happen to have pictures here, which you kindly sent me. So beautiful pictures that demand to be shared. Isn't she gorgeous? That's when she's setting off.
Yeah.
And then when she's a nurse, let me see. When was that taken, Mary?
I think that was the Dublin one. This one is in America with her handbag. That's 1961 in New York.
Okay.
And then the other one, I think, was when she was nursing in Dublin, when she was a young trainee. It's in Dublin anyway. The other one, I think, in the Richmond hospital. Yes. That's her on the left.
On the left. Okay. Okay. I'm just noticing now we've got 3 minutes left. Is there any chance that we could go out with you reading a passage?
Sure. Yeah.
That would be wonderful. Problem. And we'll pick up the conversation next week, because it's lovely to hear the family stories and what inspired the book. But if you wouldn't mind just to share a little
part of the book with us. Sure.
I think you mentioned, was it from chapter 5 you're thinking?
Yeah.
Brilliant. And what page was that, Mary?
In the hardback, it's 57. I think it's something similar in the, yes, actually it's the same in the paperback.
Oh, brilliant. 57, chapter 5.
Yeah. So Tess is at 23 at this stage, and her older sister Claire is already in America, and Dennis is her brother. So this is the adult part of the book starting. Late in the summer of 62, Tess flew on a TWA flight from Shannon Airport to New York. Before she left that morning, her father handed her a £50 note and then shook her hand formally, awkwardly. Dennis and Maeve and Evelyn, in a hat and pregnant again, sat into the car. As they drove away, Tess looked back at the house, her eyes lingering on the upstairs windows, then out at the land. Halfway down the avenue, Dennis stopped the car to get something from the boot. She turned her head to the lone ash tree among the beeches and saw for the first time a band of barbed wire embedded in the trunk, the flesh forced to grow over the spikes in pained little folds and swellings. Dennis sat in and they drove on. How had she missed this before? Who had done it? This was Lohan land, a Lohan tree, so a Lohan hand. At the airport, the summer wind gusted and blew Evelyn's hat off, and she ran after it, and they all laughed. This will be my memory, she thought. As they parted, they threw holy water on her, and she blessed herself. Dennis looked down, his long arms hanging, and she remembered the injured Ash again. Before the takeoff, she grew frantic. The plane roared down the runway, and she bent her head. It was not flying, she feared, but dying. When the wheels lifted and the plane began to climb, she pressed her fingers to her ears. Then she remembered the date, the 15th of August, the feast of the Assumption of Our Lady into heaven, and her heart began to quell. God would not let a plane crash on Our Lady's feast day. She began to fill up with trust, like a child newly assured. The roar of the engine eased and the plane leveled, and in a while she opened her eyes. They were in upper earth. They had broken through into the blue. Dazzling light, glorious. For a moment, all thought ceased, and there was this, a glimpse, a proximity, a feeling of being a fraction of a second away from something pure and sublime, a hair's breadth from the divine. And then it was gone, the clarity, the fleeting elation. And she looked up and saw the other passengers sitting there, reading, sleeping, or in quiet contemplation.
Thank you for the lovely fleeting elation of that passage. which we
Thank
will
you very much.
enjoy in quiet contemplation now after the book club. And we will pick up next week. Thank you so much, Mary.
Thanks,
and thanks so
Emily.
much to everybody. Looking
Thank you
forward
all.
to continuing the chat next week.
All right.
Ihuwa.
Ihuwa.
Slán Paul. Fáilte go club leabhar ban údar an iarthar seachtain na chathair, á cur I láthair ag leabharlann Fhadhblionn na Gaillimhe le tacaíocht ó Creative Ireland. Fáilte arás a cóirde go dtí seachtain na chathair. You're very welcome to week 4 of the Women Writers of the West online book club presented by Galway Public Libraries with the generous support of Creative Ireland. Over a 6-week period, we're exploring 3 acclaimed novels by some of Ireland's most exciting women writers based in the Galway region. Our 3 strong contrasting voices are Elaine Feeney, Mary Costello and Nuala O'Connor. Now, we started last month with Elaine Feeney's debut, award-winning debut, As You Were, and then last week we started looking at Academy Street by Mary Costello. Next week we're moving on to this wonderful book, Becoming Belle by Nuala O'Connor, and interestingly, this is the actual heroine on the cover. I didn't expect this when I bought it. I was drawn to the image. I knew the story would be fascinating, set in Victorian London, but I didn't realise that this was her actual image. So she was quite a beauty in Victorian London. Her name was Isabel Bilton, and it is fictional, but it's based on a historical figure. So, yeah, really looking forward to this book next week. And I'd encourage you to start getting your hands on a copy and start reading, because it's just over 360 pages, so it's a little bit longer than the books that we've been exploring up to now. But it just glides along beautifully, and it's a very rewarding read, highly enjoyable. So this evening we're going to go deeper into the novel and Academy Street, this beautiful novella that we've been looking at. And we're going to talk more broadly with Mary about her writing process, and also about her most recent book, The River Capture, which was published in 2019 and was shortlisted for the Irish Book Awards, the Kerry Novel Group of the Year and the Dalkey Novel Award. So as you can see, we're devoting 2 weeks to each book, so we're slowing down and enjoying the beauty of reading and the pleasure that it brings, and it's giving us plenty of time to finish the books, hopefully. So each session is different, and there's variety each week. We'll ask different questions, we'll explore different viewpoints of the book, and we're broadening out, I suppose. In the second session of each book, we kind of expand the conversation to situate the book in the writer's broader corpus of work, and maybe to talk about some work in progress, and also any writing tips they have and who their favourite authors are and all of those kind of questions. So last week we started to look at this beautiful novella, which introduces us to the quiet world of Tess Lohan, who's growing up in the west of Ireland in the 1940s. And there were many highly enthusiastic initial responses to the book. And I'm hoping to perhaps delve a little bit deeper this evening, and I'm hoping that you've had a chance to finish reading it as well. Rereading some of the reviews of this remarkably strong debut has been really enjoyable and pleasant and eye-opening. And for example, in The Scotsman, I did a bit of sleuthing on JSTOR and I found this. So the title itself is arresting. Mary Costello's debut is so good, it's in the John McGahern League. What an accolade to get for your first novel. And then he says, this book is so brief that you could read it in an evening, but this would withhold its riches, not least the all-encompassing stillness of often brilliantly subtle writing, which demands that the reader pause to allow the tremor or the tenderness or the exactness of a description or simple transaction to make precise, indelible marks, pinpointing a mood, provoking reflection. So I just thought that was worth sharing with you because it's such a stunning quotation, a stunning review to get for one's first novel. And of course, it reminds us why the book got Irish Novel of the Year in 2014. So we're going to go on now to, and as I say in sharing that review, I'd love to talk and tease out with Mary maybe some of her writing process, some of her methods, and how she controls the text so beautifully with the foreground of Tessa's life and the background of the Bay of Pigs and all that was happening in the world, and how she does that in such a tight frame of 171 pages. So we'll look forward to that chat later on. So we're going to come on now to our group discussion, and I have 3 questions to stimulate your conversation this evening. And again, they're just guidelines. If you want to depart from the questions, and you know, if you don't get through them all, don't worry. But whichever one you want to focus on, this is to stimulate your conversations. So this week's questions: what did you enjoy most about Academy Street, and what did you least enjoy about the book, if anything? Do you think that Tess changes or grows by the end of the story? And a bit of fun for the last two parts to the last question. If you could hear the same story from another person's point of view, which character would you choose? And then again, we often have fun with this one. If you're making a movie of Academy Street, who would you cast as Tess, Claire, Theo, Willa, the main characters? Hi everyone, and welcome back. It was really lovely to hear your thoughts and your different viewpoints on the book, and I think many of you are really taken with the prose. Just that beautiful, crisp writing that Mary is so masterful at, with lovely, I suppose, precision of language and lovely imagery. And there was healthy debate as well going on about, you know, why didn't she connect more with Oliver and her family and various things like that? And did she change? Some people thought she didn't actually change, but that she was naturally introverted and the grief magnified that. And then other people thought maybe she did change a little bit. So it'd be lovely to have a quick, maybe a little bit of feedback from each group. So in room 1, we had 2 Eileens, Eileen Murphy and Eileen O'Connor. We had Martina and Rita. In room 2, we had Bernie, Bridget, Monica and Regina. Room 3, Kay, Martin and Evelyn and Patricia. And in room 4, we had Jenny, Rosie, Sarah. And then in room 5, Anne, Cecily and Mary. And there were a few people kind of floating. I was saying it was like Lanigan's ball. I stepped out and I stepped in again. And maybe it was connections and various things, people putting on the kettle. So if I haven't included your name there, apologies. I think I've covered most people. So room 1, what did you think about, if I recall, you were talking about Oliver and what happened to him and things like that. Would anyone like to share just a feedback what you thought about in room 1? How about Eileen Murphy? I'll put Eileen on the spot. If you could unmute as well, please, folks, because that happens sometimes when we come back, that it seems to mute people again.
Actually,
Here I am.
Okay.
Okay.
Who's?
What?
I can't see everyone, so it's.
Did you want to say something there, Eileen, about your just a little bit of feedback from room 1?
Okay, well, we loved the language, and that was the main thing. We really thought she had great economy of creating whole characters. We had 1 or 2 things. I think we all agreed that the other voice, if they were telling the story, we'd like to hear Willa telling the story. We wondered, somebody in the group wondered about Oliver.
Yes.
And why she hadn't kept in touch with Oliver, and
yes.
Oliver sounded like somebody we'd like to know more about.
Yes.
Now, actually, Rita was nominated to be the feedbacker.
Oh,
the person
Rita, we'll put you on the spot next week. We'll note that down. So
sorry, I had trouble unmuting myself, so sorry.
Oh, no problem,
Okay.
no problem.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Eileen, for that. That was a very good roundup there. In room 2, Bernie, Bridget, Monica, Regina, who'd like to just give us a few summatory words? Bernie, you're directly in my line of vision here.
Mute. What do I say? I thought it was interesting in the group that there was some people thought that Tess had lived a very lonely life, and others disagreed with that it was very much that she lived a life that suited the type of person she was, and that she had very much an internal life.
Yes.
We looked a little bit at the relationship of Tess to her son and how it had changed during his teenage years and things like that. And someone felt it was unusual, that it was a bit out of character when he came back in the end and showed such understanding of Tess, of his mother. And
that's brilliant. That's more than enough. I just want to get a few little points, a few bullet points from each group. So room 3, thanks very much, Bernie. We had Kay, Martin and Evelyn and Patricia in room 3. Would anyone like to just give us a little overview of what you were talking about there? Evelyn, and you're actually on mute there, Evelyn, if you wouldn't mind unmuting, please.
Okay. Hi, Emily. Hi, everybody. Yeah, we had a lovely chat about the novel, Emily, and I suppose we just spent a little bit of time chatting about the early, that incredible piece about the loss of her mother and the grief and how that followed her throughout her life. And also how life, you know, she raised her little boy, she was a nurse, she worked very hard, and there was almost a shame like there was shame and grief, I think, were the themes, I think, for us. And Martin, you said there about the ring, how she bought a cheap ring to go to work. Even though in America, like, nobody would have cared, but you'd be thinking at home, like here in Ireland, they would.
And again, that's such artful use of symbolism, the ring, and you know, we were talking about the briar and the tree and everything, that she's such crisp language and precise imagery as well. That's wonderful.
And the grief kind of nearly pushed her into a bit of kind of inertia in a way. That was enough for her, like, to manage the little boy in her life.
Yes, indeed.
Somebody was saying, why didn't she contact her own sister and all of that?
Yes.
And everybody loved the relationship with is it Michael Connolly?
Oh yes, that was beautiful. Beautifully drawn as well.
I thought that was brilliant. And actually Edna O'Brien talks about when she was growing up and she was afraid of the father and everything, but there was somebody who worked on the farm that had the bit of laugh at her and made her feel special. It was lovely.
That's lovely. And she has a figure like that in her book, The China Factory, as well. In some of the stories, Gus appears in The China Factory.
She does.
I'm just looking now, and Mary's actually joining us. So rooms 4 and 5, we might leave it for this week because we're just a little short on time. And I'd like to welcome Mary back to the group. For week 2. Mary, we've so many questions to ask you and we've got about 20 minutes, so I'm going to go straight in. Just to, I suppose, recap on your credentials for people who are joining us for the first time. Your first book, The China Factory, was nominated for the Guardian First Book Award and an Irish Book Award. Academy Street won the Irish Novel of the Year and the Irish Book of the Year awards and was shortlisted for the International Dublin Literary Award, the Costa First Novel Prize, and the EU Prize for Literature. The River Capture 2019, which I've been showing everyone here, was shortlisted for the Irish Book Awards, the Curry Group Novel of the Year, and the Dalkey Novel Award. So you're extremely welcome back, Mary. We're delighted to have you with us again.
Thanks, Emily.
I suppose I'd like to start with maybe broadening out to talk about your writing life and things that we didn't get to cover last week. And then we might return to the novel itself and then ask you some general questions that I'm putting to each of the authors of the book club about your own favorite writers and any tips you have and any work in progress or indeed your new book. So I was really struck by an interview in the Sunday Times in 2019 when you talked about the fact that you had tried to suppress the impulse to write for many years because you wanted to be normal like your family and friends, but the urge kept resurfacing. And I have to ask you, you know, when you finally did just decide to go with it and produced your short story collection, The China Factory, how did that feel? You must have felt vindicated in your choices?
I did. Can you hear me okay now? My
can,
line is
yeah,
a bit
yeah,
funny
I can
tonight.
hear you fine,
Okay.
yep, I can indeed,
I
yep.
had to go on my iPhone there for a while at the hotspot because the line was a bit shaky. But
Okay.
yes, no, when I was younger, I didn't have this ambition to be a writer or this need even, you know,
Yes.
I went to college, I studied English. I always loved English, especially poetry. And then when I was about 22 or 23, about 22, I was teaching. I was a teacher in Dublin in Tala, and I was going out with the man I was going to marry, and I seemed happy. I felt everything was okay, but I went through a period of really bad insomnia. I didn't know what. I knew something was gnawing at me, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And then one night, a few months in, it just came to me. I want to write. I can't explain it. I studied Jung years afterwards, and he used a word, Carl Jung, the Swiss psychotherapist, he used a word called Einfall, a German word, where something just drops down out of nowhere for you. So I started writing and reading a lot, and I went to Listowel Writers Week and then heard the names of, you know, Raymond Carver, Alice Munro, Joyce Carol Oates, Flannery O'Connor, all of those. And it was like I found my tribe. I had this huge surge of just affinity and knowingness, and I couldn't believe they'd existed there. I was young enough, but I still in college, you know, we had done the classics. We hadn't really done modern fiction very much. So I started to write, and I had a couple of stories published. Actually, the very first time I was shortlisted for the Hennessy Award, and Mike McCormack was shortlisted on the same night. But then I got married when I was 23, and I didn't send work out. I had 2 stories published in the Sunday Tribune, which was New Irish Writing. And then writing, I was teaching full time and I was married, and I just couldn't seem to accommodate all the things. So writing went underground for me. That's the best way I can describe it. It felt like a burden. I didn't publish anymore, and I didn't really tell people I was writing. And it felt like an interruption in my life, and it fell into the margins, as it were. I still wrote, it wouldn't go away. You know, I'd give it up because I wanted peace. I wanted to be free of it. It felt like something that was a burden and an interruption. And I would write a story and work on it for a few months and then put it away. And I felt purged then that I'd be normal again. And I just wanted to be normal. I didn't want this thing that was at me. So that's how I wrote many stories. So by the time I was in, my marriage broke up in my 30s then, and I had a few difficult years. So I was into my 40s before I sent work out. And that's how my first book came around. So I did fight it, you know, I just...
That's fascinating, Mary. And I totally get the feeling of that enslavement to the writing chair and the desk and having to put those words down. And a lot of writers do feel that it's like, I know D.H. Lawrence said it's a disease, and and other writers, they often don't speak in these warm terms about the duty of having to write. But when you have a gift like yours, it must have been, as you say, they're incubating all the time. And, when you won then all of these accolades, and you talk about the Tribune and the Hennessy, and these are prestigious awards to be part of. When you got those accolades for your debut novel, how did that feel? Was that overwhelming? Or did it feel like a great affirmation then of your decision? Or did you feel kind of daunted by it all? Or yeah.
I was older, I was in my late 40s at that stage. So I don't know how I would have felt if it had come earlier. But the other thing is, there is always the imposter syndrome. You think, who do you think you are? I come from a family of teachers and farmers. There are no writers, there are no artistic people really. So you always think, well, who do you think you are? And it's never, I felt I wanted to be a writer, but I needed to write. It has to be essential. If I didn't have to do it, I wouldn't do it. It's something that I have to do because, the one thing, it came to me one night in an interview after the first book, The China Factory, why do you write? And I said this, which I remember, and it's the way I feel. I wasn't right when I wasn't writing. I wasn't right either when I was writing, but I was less wrong. I felt less wrong.
I think you're very hard on yourself, Mary, now.
but then even when you publish your first book, you think you're a one-horse pony or one trick pony, or one horse,
Yes.
one trick pony. And even the second book, and you always worry, there's always self-doubt. You always think,
Self-doubt,
okay,
yes.
I'm only as good as the page in front of me. And even still, you know, I think, oh, and then I think, well, so what? If I never write again, that's okay. The word's not going to change, you know. But so you really do it because you have to, you know, there is no peace unless you're doing it.
Okay, well, we're all very grateful that you're doing it. From a selfish perspective, I just want to say that. Returning to the book itself, I'm just trying to find, I suppose, connections between some of the books. And it's striking that, you know, in our last book, As You Were, we had a significant figure in Magpie. And in Academy Street, the blackbird interrupts the scene at a significant moment and tears the wallpaper, perhaps reminding the reader of our powerlessness at times of loss. I'm intrigued to learn what inspired that scene. It's so vividly rendered.
Yeah, well, I think I was telling you last week that Easterfield is modelled on my mother's family
Yes.
home. And I remembered when I was a child going there, and my aunts and uncles had, you know, young family themselves, and at Christmas that all the family would gather there for big, you know, you might call them parties, but this was in the country. We didn't do parties, you know, you'd have a big meal and a big long table and everything, but they weren't fancy or anything. But I remember my mother told me, like in what was the drawing room, even though it was well gone down and shabby and everything, but over one of the high windows, there were high Georgian windows, there was a piece of wallpaper missing. My mother told me when she was young, a bird flew into the room and pecked off a piece of the good wallpaper, and it still was missing, you know, after all those years. And it probably was very good. It might have been William Morris wallpaper, I don't know, but it was there for, you know, generations. And I don't know what kind of a bird, but my mother told me that story when I was young. And, you know, she told me lots of stories about her childhood in that house. So that was, you know, when I started writing Academy Street and I was doing the child part, you know, that's something that resonated with me. And it's something a child would always remember, because I remembered it from childhood. So it really did happen, or that's what my mother says anyway.
Yes, that's fascinating. I have so many questions now, and I'm just going to kind of roll along and go with the flow, because I suppose coming back to your actual writing, you know, we want to know a little bit about your process, because it's so fascinating. And I read the quote from Tom Adair about slowing down to appreciate the precision of your language and everything. And I suppose you talked last week about the book being in 3 parts, and the first part is the child's point of view. I thought that was really interesting. So a few little things. Your writing style, lovely, crisp, precise, and you favor the short sentence. I think you don't. I don't think there are any semicolons in the book. Maybe I'm wrong, but would that be true to say that you like the short?
Well, yes, it is. It's certainly in Academy Street and the River Capture, there are lots of colons. The second half is lots of long sentences.
Yes,
you know, I don't want, but certainly I do favor simplicity. I do favor the plain, simple truth. Yes. And that applies to language as much as anything else. Of course, I like sophisticated thought and everything, but I do think that the unadorned, stripped back language can have the greatest impact in its simplicity. You know, that I'm not fond of ornamentation in anything, you know, whether it's music or that. I do like things to be bare and stripped back. One of my favorite writers is J.M. Costello, and you know, he states it very clearly. And I had a friend who was passed away now, but years ago he went on a workshop. John McGahern used to have workshops in UIG, which was what was it called? UHG at the time.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
UCG,
UCG, yeah.
So way back,
I still call it UCG. In my head, I'm still back in UCG.
Way back, I think in maybe the early 90s, certainly the 80s and 90s, had workshops. And my friend said that, you know, one day they were doing workshopping a piece, and one of the guys said, you know, I've used, I forget what the word was, but let's say illuminate. I've used the word illuminate twice in my story. Is that too much? And McGahern said, once is too much.
Wow.
Too much. In other words, even a word like illuminate, I'm not saying it was illuminate, I can't remember, it was some word, you know, there was a little nice.
Kind of a few syllables to it. Yeah,
and he said once was too much, twice was, even once was too much. So that's a very important yardstick. But I do think as well that the crisp sentences, in Academy Street, I wrote that novel in a year. It came easily enough. I knew the story ahead. I knew where I wanted to end up. I don't know whether everyone has got to the end or whether they know the ending, but
Most people have, yes.
Yeah, well, what happens at the end? Not everyone liked it; they didn't see it coming. But a relative of mine, who I didn't know about, a second cousin who had been born to a woman who wasn't married years ago in the 60s, and he was a trader in the Twin Towers, and he went down in 9/11. And I only discovered this about 2 years later.
Oh, okay.
And he would have been a second cousin of mine. So I couldn't believe, because I modeled Tess a little bit on my Aunt Carmel, but my Aunt Carmel stayed in America just for 4 years in the early 60s. She was a nurse in the Columbia Hospital, and I was saying to you one day, she nursed Mrs. Roosevelt and Cole Porter, and Marilyn Monroe was in the psych ward. But so my aunt used to tell me all these stories, but she had a friend who was an Irish girl who was a nurse at the time, and she got pregnant. And so I had a few mixes and matches. And my aunt came back and got married. And, you know, when the book came out, I worried a little bit. She might think that people would think that she had a child in America and gave him up or something. Yes. And I was a little bit worried, but I said that to my aunt after she'd read it. I said, I was so afraid you might be afraid that and she said, no, she said, I wish I had she doesn't have children. She said, I wish I had a child and he might come looking for me now, so a lot of
lovely and supportive.
Yeah. But for as regards the simplicity of the writing, or, keeping it simple, one of the really important things that I found that I had to work a little bit harder at in Academy Street was making the time shifts, because it's a short enough book. It's 45,000 words. It's about the same length. Donal Ryan and myself, I think we're talking. I think that Spinning Heart is about the same length. So it's a short-ish novel, not the shortest novel, but short enough. And to get it a span of time, an opening sentence of a chapter, a very simple sentence that can convey the passage of time and something about the character, was very important to me. So I used to work hard at those transitions where instead of, so Tess moves into her 60s, we leave her in a chapter where her son is a teenager and getting married, and then we move on into her 60s fairly swiftly, and she's starting to read and have the life of the mind, because the whole book really for Tess is about the journey towards, she's trying to put her finger on something all the time, trying to put her finger on some higher note. And, it's love, or it's, she's drawn towards something higher, something more luminous or numinous, maybe divine. So the religious choral music in the church strikes her, poetry gets it. I think a lot of people's journey in life is about that. It's trying to put your finger, and some people find it in art, some people find it in music, some people find it in religion, but it's trying to touch that higher note, and it's the impulse towards consciousness. And she knows love with Theo. And even though things go wrong in her life, I think by the end of her life, she understands that nothing is wasted. The journey is the journey, and nothing is wasted. We're all edging towards consciousness,
And that's a lovely part of the book, that you have dignified the quite heroic, lonely life, the interior life, and the richness of that. And you've foregrounded that and brought it to the surface. And I think that's beautiful. And the act of reading it, the book is kind of a meditation on the act of reading as well. And it kind of foreshadows your preoccupations in the river capture. Could you tell us a little bit about this book and maybe read us a small?
Sure. It's entirely different. The inspiration for this is that originally I had thought there's a woman. The story of the river capture features around a 33-year-old young man, Luke O'Brien, who's a teacher and a very bookish guy and smart, also looking to examine life. They examined life, and looking to also grow and become aware and find some meaning somewhere. So he moves from Dublin. He's a teacher, an English teacher in Belvedere College, and he moves from Dublin back to his family farm, inherited house, a large house as well, on the bend of a river, which gives its name to the title. A river captures when a river suddenly changes direction because it's been usurped by an older, drier river underneath. And that's really a metaphor for how lives suddenly go off track. They change direction. And Luke is the kind who's very, a bit like the young Tess in a way, very porous to the environment, porous to the landscape, sensitive to almost the atmosphere around him. And he also...
To Joyce, of course. And Stephen Bloom, he's very positive, Joyce.
Yes,
Yeah.
he is. Yeah. He's a Joycean, as I am myself. And that's the thing about writing. Whatever is important in one's, for me anyway, leaks in, it bleeds into the writing. And I love Joyce, and because Luke is a bookish guy, I went all out and gave it to him because it's my homage to Joyce, but also because I'm obsessed a little bit. So that came through in Luke O'Brien as well. But one of the important things about him is he cares for his elderly aunt and his mother. And I sometimes, people would say, but this is very unlikely, a 33-year-old man, looking after older aunts. He's also boozing a lot, and he's, having a full life in many ways. But he does care. We often think it's always women. It's women who care for the elderly ones. But I know several men who do too. So I always think it isn't always fair to stereotype.
To highlight that, actually, Mary. Yeah.
So, so will I read a little bit?
That'd be great. Thank you. We've got about 3 minutes left. I'm sure we can extend that to 5 minutes. And if anyone wants to ask a question, if you want to pop it in the chat for Mary there while we have her with us, and we can move towards a conclusion. But yes, please read from the river. We'd love to hear it.
So this is just Luke is a big drinker, so he lives alone, and it's evening time, and he's remembering back his life in Dublin when his girlfriend Maeve lived with him, and Lily is his cat. So it's evening time. The house has settled around him, restive now. He opens a bottle of Rioja, admires the ruby glow of the wine streaming into the glass. He sips it, lets it linger on his palate for a moment, then down his gullet it goes. Outside, a bird is singing in short, sweet trills. Maeve had wanted to get a parrot for the flat in Harold's Cross, but he never liked the idea of caged birds. Joyce kept 2 little parakeets for a while in Paris, Pierre and Pippi. One of them flew in the window one day and stayed, and not wanting it to be alone, he acquired the other. Probably saw it as a sign. Wonder if he clipped their wings, or taught them to speak, or sang to them. Probably spent hours peering at them with his poor eyesight, delighting in their plumage, in their little nipping and kissing and beak tapping, leaning in closer, imitating their whistles and chirrups, picking up their secret little tones in his inner ear, slipping deeper and deeper into communion with them until he emitted his own little trills and twitterings in reply to theirs. Luke boils potatoes, fries steak in a little butter and garlic, then lifts it onto a warm plate and lets the brownish meat juice trickle over it. Lily will soon appear, drawn by the aroma. At the table, he draws the Borges book and a book of Derek Mahan's poems close to him. Certain nights are right for poems, and he has a knack of opening a page at random, hitting on exactly the right one. He pours more wine. When he cuts into the steak, blood-brown juices run out, and he salivates. The meat is delicious. He thinks of Bloom's pork kidney and wonders why he ate pork. He wonders if it really is possible to taste urine off a cooked kidney. He remembers his alarm the first time he got a strong sulfurous whiff of his own urine after eating asparagus. And stop there.
Beautiful imagery there. And Derek Mahan and Borges, yeah, wonderful writers. There's a lot of intertextual, as you say, homage in the book, and it really is a celebration of bibliophilia and love of books as well, and reading. And so thank you very much. There are some questions coming in here for you, Mary. And a number of people were curious as to why you called the book Academy Street instead of perhaps Easterfield, or
Well, that I was telling you, my aunt had moved to America in the early 60s, and my mother, I was born in the mid 60s, and my mother was a young married woman with a few of us. So she would, and there were a few girls in her family. So Carmel, oh yeah, you're still there.
I'm actually going to share, because you kindly sent me a picture of Academy Street, and I'm going to share it if that's okay with you.
Sure, yeah. And if you can zoom in there, up on the post, there's a green little sign. It's very,
Academy
see, there it
Street.
is, Academy Street.
There it is, yes.
So that's in Manhattan. That's at the very tip of Manhattan in a place called Inwood. It's a very Hispanic area now, but in the 60s, it was a real Irish enclave. And when a few years ago, my aunt would have written to her sisters, and my mother being one of them, all through this, you know, when she'd be away. So a few years ago, my aunt, whose husband had died, and my mother were out in Connemara for a few days in a hotel break, and my father's dead as well. So the 2 or 3 sisters went out. So I went out to join them for dinner. And I was thinking about writing this novel around that time, and I had no title for it. But at the dinner, I was asking Carmel about her time in America, and my mother was talking. And then Carmel said, I lived on a street up there, up in Inwood. What was the name of it? And my mother said, 451 Academy Street, just like that. She remembered the address from writing to my aunt all the time. My mother's a good memory for small details like that. So she said 451 Academy Street. Yes. And I heard Academy Street and I knew instantly. You knew instantly. I just thought, oh, so in 2011, I did a house swap. I was a teacher at the time. So I swapped my house in Dublin for a month for an apartment in Manhattan. And every day I used to take the A train up, and I found the street and I found the building that my aunt lived in. And so I buzzed a few buttons, and somebody buzzed me in, and I walked in and took photographs, and I phoned my aunt back in Galway. And I said, guess where I am? And I walked around those streets, and I was very moved, because I felt, you know, the Irish immigrants were there. I went to the church, the school, the library, and there were the streets that formed the background for Tess's life, even though Tess is fictional. Tess's mind is my mind in a way. So she's, you know, even though some biographical details are my aunt's or my mother's, really as a child and as an adult, she's a fictional character. But I've used some.
You've absorbed and internalized so much, and of the place as well, because you took the trouble to research and to revisit those streets. And here is the park.
Inwood Park, where Theo, yes. She would have brought Theo, and actually there's a scene towards the end of the book where she goes back and she stands outside the park and she's looking up at the school. And I did that the summer's day, and I was looking up at the school, and it was a 2 or 3 story. It's like a Catholic school built from the 50s. And it was around 2 o'clock, and the parents were starting to gather at the big gate. And upstairs, I could see little hands going up. The lights were on, even though it was, you know, it was a darkened room. And I could see small hands going up for the teacher. And I just thought, wow, if a mother was looking at that, you know, with the little hands going up. So I used that scene that I went to myself in the scene at the end when I think Tess sees kids in a room or in the school.
Yes. And Mary, so that, I mean, what you're telling us there is that it was incubating over a long period of time, but to get that point of view, to build that world of your character, it does take a really long time to get inside the character's head, or does it? Or, you know, does it, do you get inside her head or his head, and then you kind of layer it in with, you know, you build the images, or do you have to get the full thing, as much detail as you can at the start, and then go into the character more fully?
Well, I think because I had the child, I was with her from the time she was very, very small, and her perceptions, I suppose, were probably as what my perceptions as a child were. You know, I would have been alert to little things around me. So I think most writers write out of a lot of their own experience. You know, Costello, my favorite writer, says all writing is autobiographical, fiction and fiction. Okay. Of course, we don't use all the facts. McGahern said he could never use things directly from life. It was too much. He had to reinvent and reimagine them. Okay. And, you know, so you have to mix around. But the psychological part, the interior part is what interests me most. And then I had a few points, like, you know, when Tess gets pregnant and she's coming home from work one evening and she's climbing up the stairs. It's February. She's tired after a nursing day and she's heavily pregnant. And a door opens out onto a corridor and Willa comes out. That absolutely happened on the moment. I had no will. Really? Completely fictional. But as I was writing that chapter, and as Tess was trudging up the door, a door opened and a woman came out to put stuff into the refuse chute. And that was Willa, and she was kind. And that was
wonderful.
That was one of those things that just happened, you know.
And I was thinking with International Women's Day yesterday of the solidarity among women, which we saw in As You Were with Elaine's book, with Margaret Rose, and then with Willa and the friendship there. So I was going to ask you how Willa was formed. So you've answered that. Thank you. Just a final question here, a very good question from Eileen O'Connor. And she says, did Mary have to or feel obliged to get permission from the Joyce estate to reference his work? Was she nervous about incorporating Joyce into her work? So the influence of anxiety and all the rest, I suppose, coming into play there. Yeah.
Yeah,
Or the
no,
anxiety of influences. No,
the influence of anxiety.
I called my pieces the reverse of it. So
the anxiety of influence. That's right.
Yeah, it was about romanticism and existentialism. So yeah, so it's the influence of anxiety. Yes, yeah.
No, I didn't. I didn't have to get permissions because Joyce, his work is out of copyright now, I think. Anyway,
Yes.
after being dead 60 years. But
Yeah.
but apart from that, because there was it was Luke, the character's love affair with literature in general, and his love affair with Bloom. Bloom is a fictional character, so. For Luke O'Brien, Bloom is like a soul guide. Bloom is a very Leopold Bloom in Ulysses is a pacifist. He's an everyman. He's also very sensitive. He lives life, a very sensual life, but also a life of the mind. So for Luke's life is wound up in the fictional life of Leopold Bloom in many ways. So no, I didn't have to get permission, and I didn't think of it as some people said afterwards to me, God, weren't you brave taking on Joyce and all that, other writers. I didn't feel I was taking on Joyce at all. Joyce, as a writer, gave me permission to do everything. He writes about everything from going to the toilet, to frying a kidney, to considering the transmigration of souls and the constellation of stars. So he
opened it up and universalized everything for us to celebrate.
So, and because I love him so much, and there were times when I was, I've read the Elman biography, I've read Nora, I've read all of the books and the letters,
Joyce, and
the letters, and I love him deeply, and he gets a bad rap for many reasons, but he was a very refined, sensitive soul, and he didn't countenance bad language. Of course, he drank a lot and was a spendthrift and all those things, but he also a very refined soul with very refined feeling. And there were days when I was working a lot into it, into river capture, and I would remember he's dead, and I almost would grieve for him. He died before he was 59 years of age. I was thinking all that knowledge gone. He died suddenly from a perforated ulcer. And I just think, oh, I can't believe he's dead. I was actually grieving for him because I liked him,
Oh, that's a lovely insight to get, Mary. Thank you so much for that. And I'm certainly enjoying it. I didn't get it finished for today now, but I'm really enjoying it. I'm very invested in Luke and Dilly and all the characters. So I'm really enjoying it. Thank you so much for enriching our book club so much. It's been a privilege talking to you. And thanks to everyone for joining us for yet another thoroughly pleasurable evening. And I look forward to seeing you next week. And we'll start discussing Becoming Belle, and we'll be chatting to Nuala O'Connor. So, Ihawa.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Slán. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye, everybody. Bye.